Welcome, Campfire crew. Let's get it on. My creepy final visit to our haunted family home by Virulent Peach. My great-aunt, who has lived for years in an 1890s Victorian home, which has been in our family for generations, recently was moved to assisted living. The home is falling apart, contaminated, and will likely be condemned and demolished. Shortly before my great-aunt was moved to assisted living, we called a plumber to inspect water drainage issues in the downstairs sink. He reported the conditions of the home to the town health inspector, and we were able to negotiate with the town for one final visit to the home to remove family heirlooms and personal belongings, after which the house will be condemned. As I pulled up to the house, ready to meet the rest of the family for a final walkthrough of the house, I was filled with sadness. Clearly, once a beautiful home and one of the largest on its street, with its gingerbread trim, multiple gables, and large windows framed with old-fashioned drapes, this was the first home my great-grandparents owned after their arrival to the United States, and the one where my grandmother grew up. I hated the thought that it would be demolished, and more importantly, I wondered what unforeseen spirits dwelled within its walls. Were my ancestors still among us? And what about those of its even earlier owners? I met my family outside the front of the house, and my grandmother unlocked the front door with a spare key. I stood back, staring up at the house, and saw a curtain on one of the attic windows billowing slightly. Was it a draft? Or something else? I grabbed my mother's attention, but the second she looked up, it stopped. As she turned away, I noticed in another attic window the shadow of what appeared to be a dark-skinned female figure in a white dress pass by, and then disappear into the distance as quickly as she appeared. Knowing the house was completely empty of living people for the last time in 130 years, this creeped me out. The yellow wallpaper in the front hallway was chipped, the floors creaked louder than ever, and though there were windows throughout the house, there was an oppressive darkness that no light from outside could penetrate, and there was this inescapable feeling that we were not alone. And again, what did I just see in the upstairs window? We split up through the house searching for items to keep. I was to search the attic and second floor, my stepdad the basement, and everyone else the first floor. The electrical wiring on the upper two floors hadn't been modified in years, so I was instructed to not turn on any lights. And as such, the upper two floors felt dark and ominous, especially the upstairs hallway. The dark doors on all sides and the wood paneling in the hallway, combined with the lack of natural sunlight, kind of felt like it was suffocating me as I was passing through, and it felt like I was being stared by eyes from all corners in the hallway. Now, just as I had in the past, I felt as if something would jump out at me from behind any one of the doors, or from behind any corner. I quickly darted into the nearest room, and I entered what was once the upstairs dining room when it was a two-family home. I began to go through boxes. I found old photographs of my great-grandparents, cousins, and other ancestors going all the way back to the 1800s. In one box, I found an old key that seemed to go to one of the locks in an old door. Curious as to what it unlocked, I tried the key in multiple doors upstairs, but it just didn't fit in any. I searched every room, and I finally entered what was the upstairs kitchen and noticed dishes in the sink that must have been left there for like 40 years. There was also an out-of-commission stove and refrigerator, and an iron sitting on an ironing board. It looked like it was still lived in, but the owners just disappeared. I finally found the lock for the key. It locked the door leading to the narrow back staircase, which opened into the downstairs kitchen. As I put the key in the lock and locked the door, I could hear my mother calling me from what sounded like the front of the house. So I ran back towards the front of the house to find out what she wanted. in the front hallway, I saw the attic door open, and I could hear boxes being moved around up there. I assumed my mom and aunt were upstairs, searching through them. So I called up. There was no answer. I called my aunt's name. No answer. Staring up the winding stairs, still hearing those footsteps and boxes being moved around, I instantly started sweating and got scared, so I called out to them again. "Hey, this isn't funny. What do you want?" Leaving the attic door open, I darted up the stairs into a hallway that was barely 6 feet to the ceiling. Narrow, white walls and green doorways and trim. At the top of the stairs, the hallway sort of bends rightward, and there are rooms on all sides, packed from ceiling to floor with boxes, old bed frames, box springs, and other assorted items. I had only been in the attic once or twice before, and honestly, I forgot what it looked like up there. And this is where it gets creepy. I could just see into the rooms enough to notice that they were not typical attic rooms. They looked like bedrooms. Clearly, another family had lived up there, and the house had once been a 3-family home, unbeknownst to the rest of us. Right now, however, the place was abandoned. Not only was no one up there, but there was no way these boxes could have been moved up there without first moving them into the hallway, as the doorway to every room in the attic was completely blocked off by these stacked boxes. I mean, it was difficult to even see into any of these rooms. Suddenly, I could hear the rustling of paper bags from the room at the very end of the hallway. And then I saw that curtain blowing around, but there was absolutely no air conditioning or draft that I could feel. I saw that the window was bolted shut, and I suddenly felt as if I was being watched from that back room. I could hear sounds emanating from multiple corners in the attic that sounded like coins being dropped one by one against the wooden floor and then rolling across it. And then it was followed by the giggling of small children. By this time, I'd had enough. I quickly bolted down the stairs, and when I made it to the bottom, I smashed right into the closed door. The closed door. The door I knew for a fact I left open, and I mentioned that I left open just a bit. I reached for the knob, and though I used all my might, it wouldn't open. The knob turned completely, but the door felt as if it was being pushed on from the other side by someone, or something, stronger than me. Suddenly, I heard soft footsteps making their way down the attic hall, bumping into one of the old wooden doors, and took it off its frame that was lying in the upstairs hallway. I could hear the click, click, click of heels as they turned the corner, making their way to the top of the stairs. My heart was racing, my palms drenched in sweat as I pounded on the door for someone to let me out. I shouted the name of every person I knew to be in the house until I finally got someone's attention. The sound of the heels walking stopped at the top of the stairs, but started to slowly make their way down. I could see a shadow emerging on the cracked white walls, a silhouette getting larger but without any defined features. This entity was creeping down the stairs, one slow step at a time. I grabbed the doorknob like my life depended on it and tried breaking it off the door, pushing, shoving, until finally the door gave way, and I stepped into the hallway. I slammed the door shut and turned to run back downstairs, but as I did, I stepped on what I felt like was a piece of paper from the upstairs hallway. It was a photograph of the same woman I thought I saw in the attic window earlier. Was she trying to tell me something? I ran downstairs in a panic, desperately seeking answers. I demanded to know if any of my family members were up in the attic trying to play a prank on me, and they all insisted that they had been downstairs the entire time, which puzzled me because I know for a fact I heard my mother's voice coming from the attic. Just as I started to assume that it was my imagination, I could hear footsteps coming from the floor immediately above me, pacing around the upstairs kitchen, directly above where I now stood. Everyone heard it, and I could see the panic in their faces. My stepdad, who does not believe in the paranormal, whispered to us that someone had likely broken into the house and was hiding upstairs. They could have likely been living there since my great-aunt was taken to assisted living, if not even longer than that. She was hearing impaired and never went upstairs. He snuck upstairs on the back staircase, slowly, quietly, with me following behind with pepper spray in hand, ready to confront whatever this intruder was. I was certain we wouldn't see one, and when we got to the top of the back staircase, the door, which I knew I shut and locked with the old key, was slightly cracked and slowly opening. Someone was clearly inviting us in. We searched the entire upstairs of the house and then the attic again, and I felt somewhat more comfortable with a male relative there. There was no one up there, and nothing that could have made any of the noises on either floor. We began to leave the attic, my stepdad in front and me behind. As I was about halfway down the stairs, I stumbled forward. I distinctly felt hands on my shoulders and something rub against the back of my neck. Whatever it was didn't push me, but I nearly fell down the stairs with fright. I began screaming and pushing my stepdad out of the way, running downstairs to the first floor. There was no way I was going back to that attic under any circumstance. My stepdad stayed on the second floor, searching through different rooms. He believed I had imagined the entire thing, and there was nothing to be afraid of. My grandmother was still sweeping downstairs and trying to make the house look somewhat presentable, likely believing she could persuade the town to spare the house. I showed her the photograph I found outside the attic door, asking if she recognized the face. Sure enough, she recognized the woman, and her story was truly sad. What had happened was the woman was my great-grandmother's sister, who had lived in the attic of the house with her 3 children after her husband had passed away. She lived there for a short period of time in the 1940s, out of sight, and she rarely came downstairs. Because of her darker complexion and the belief that her visible presence in the house would cause people to question my great-grandmother's race, she was told she could live there, but not to come down in the presence of guests. One of her children died in that attic with scarlet fever. My great-grandmother descends from a long line of mixed-race people of both European and African descent, but unfortunately believed that her light skin and ability to pass as a white woman made her superior to her sister. Until this day, I never knew of the existence of this relative, but her story deeply saddens me. I've come to wonder if every incident in this house was her way of making herself known, and the injustices that happened to her. My dad eventually came downstairs, his face pale and flustered. He demanded to know if I had been playing some sort of practical joke on him, as he claimed that while he was in one of the rooms upstairs, and all of the rooms were connected with multiple doors, he would hear a doorknob turn and open to another room. When he would look up, he would see the door slowly clicking shut and closing, so he would get up and go to that door, rip it open, look around, but there was no one else in the other room. However, suddenly the door to that room, leading to the one he was just in, would slowly shut behind him on its own. Rinse and repeat. That was also followed by footsteps he could clearly hear in other nearby rooms. He also claimed to hear a female voice calling his name, but could not identify from which room it was coming from. Again, every room he would enter, it would sound like it was coming from somewhere else. We all told him that we had been downstairs the entire time, and I knew that we had been. He kept insisting that it was all a big prank and that we were all hiding in different rooms trying to conspire against him. Please, we weren't. He also said that out of the corner of his eye, he would see movement, but then when he turned, nothing was there. Finally, we had collected all the items we wanted and had loaded up the car and took one last look at the home. It was truly sad to know that this was the last time that we were going to see it. We all got into our respective cars, and as I drove away, I turned back to look at the house, I can't be sure of it, but I could swear from the upstairs attic window in the back, I saw the silhouette of that woman wearing a white dress, hair pinned up, turned sideways, staring out into the backyard. When the house is torn down, I wonder if she will go down with it, or will she finally find peace? Or will she find some other way to find us and finally convey her message? We all discussed our experiences, and no one but me believes the house was haunted. Everyone believes I was imagining my experiences in the attic. My stepdad believes I was playing a prank, but I know better. Encountering Shadow Beings by Michael. I've spent the last 13 years trying my best to forget the events that took place in a week in 1989, but it sticks in my memory like it happened yesterday. It was winter break at college, and I was bracing for a week alone on campus. My school was in Tennessee, and my home was in New Hampshire. I was unable to make such a long trip home, but my friend Jim invited me to join him and his family that week in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and I accepted. On the trip to Michigan, Jim told me that his younger brother Mark was doing a favor for someone who was out of town. He was house-sitting for them while they were gone, seeing that their dog was fed and hanging around the place once in a while, so it looked like it was being lived in. We arrived at Jim's house in Ann Arbor on a cold and rainy night, and I met his family, including his brothers Mark and Chucky, who was the youngest of the family at about 13. Jim, Chucky, and I rode along with Mark when he went to check on the place that he was house-sitting. And on the way over, he told us about some strange things that were happening to him while he was there. Mark said that late one night, around 2 a.m., he was sitting alone upstairs in the master bedroom watching television, and he heard voices downstairs. At first, he was afraid that someone had broken in without his realizing it. All the lights downstairs were out, and when Mark turned the volume down on the television set, the voices became louder. He went out into the hall and looked over the thin metal railing by the stairs. He heard loud whispers at the bottom, but he couldn't make out what they were saying. Then he saw a large, dark shadow of a woman coming up the stairs, and as it approached, the whispers became louder and seemed to be emanating from the shadowy figure. Mark even heard footsteps as the entity came up the stairs. He told us that he'd been really scared, and then ran back into the master bedroom, sat in a chair, and changed the station on the television to a Christian channel. He grabbed a Bible and held on for dear life, and sat there with the volume up, Bible in his hands, but he could still hear the dark figure moving up the stairs and towards the room he was in. The footsteps and the voices kept growing louder, and then the shadow of a woman appeared in the doorway to the room he was in. It disappeared as quickly as it had manifested, and Mark felt a cold wind pass by him, and the curtains billowed as the shadowy figure went out the window that he had opened earlier to get some fresh air. By the time we turned up the road to the house, Mark had finished his story. We prayed and tried to prepare for anything that might come. The house was large, dark brown or black, I don't remember, but the yard had a metal fence that separated the property from a cemetery. It may have appeared to be a normal house by day, but at night it looked like something right out of a horror movie. We pulled into the driveway and then went up to the house. When we got out of the car, Mark pointed to the second story of the house and pointed to the window of the master bedroom where he was occasionally watching television. As I looked up to the window, I saw a bluish flickering light, and I asked Mark if he was absolutely certain that he had turned off the television the last time he had used it. He replied that he was sure that he did. When we reached the door to the house, we found the dog scratching wildly against it on the inside, so we opened the door, and the dog shot out into the yard as fast as a bullet out of a gun, and as he kept running, he looked back at the house as if he wanted to get far away from it. The first impression I got when we entered the house was that the atmosphere just seemed to be so tense, you could cut it with a knife. This was the first time I actually sensed the presence of a spirit. Mark began to perform his duties as house sitter. He just had to check phone messages, make a call or two, and take the mail inside and so forth. I was convinced that, in spite of what he had said, Mark had left the television on in the master bedroom, so Jim and I were about to go upstairs and turn it off. But suddenly, we just had this spooky feeling like we were being closely watched. I looked around, and Chucky was gone. I thought maybe he went back outside, so I went to check on him. As I expected, he had gone outside and was staring up at the master bedroom. I was shocked to see that it was totally dark in that room, even though I knew light had filled it only moments before. At that point, we knew something weird was going on, but we weren't freaking out. We told Mark to complete his business so that we could just get out of there as fast as we could. While we were waiting for Mark, we began to hear footsteps coming from the upstairs hallway. Then we began to hear the same kind of whispers that Mark had talked about, as if many voices were speaking at once in an unintelligible murmur. They were coming from upstairs, and getting louder with every footstep. I stood at the bottom of the stairs and heard the footsteps and voices moving down them towards us, so I called Jim over, and he heard and sensed the same thing. No doubt about it, the voices and footsteps were getting closer to us. By this time, Mark had finished with his chores, and we were getting ready to lock up. Jim went out and dragged the dog back into the house against the animal's will. It was obvious the house was the last place it wanted to be. Chucky had wandered outside again, and once again, I found him staring up at the window of the master bedroom. He stood there staring as if in a daze, but he broke out of it when the flickering bluish light suddenly returned. I told Chucky to stay where he was, and I went back inside. Just as we were ready to leave, a shadowy figure came out of a dark room at the end of the downstairs hallway and began moving towards us. I was a Pentecostal Christian at that point in my life, as were Jim and Mark, and we believed that we were in the presence of devils. We began to rebuke the creature in the name of Jesus, as we had been taught to do so in such situations. The spirit, entity, or whatever it was, didn't go away, but it did stop moving towards us. Once again, we began to hear voices and footsteps coming towards us from the stairs, so we ran out of the house, locked the door, grabbed Chucky, who was still staring up at the window of the master bedroom, got into the car, and drove away. We assumed that would be the end of it, since we didn't have to go back to the house. But we were wrong. The night before Jim and I were to go back to school, I couldn't sleep. I had the feeling that someone was watching me very closely, just as I had when I entered the house when Mark was house-sitting. This unnerved me, as there was no reason that should have happened in Jim's house. I just took a blanket and went downstairs to hang out and read. Chucky came downstairs and said that he wanted to talk to me, so we did, and then we decided to pray. Jim and I were both studying to be preachers, so we believed in faith and spiritual warfare. Chucky told me that he wanted to receive what Pentecostals call the baptism in the Holy Ghost, during which people speak in tongues. We knelt by the couch to pray on our knees, and Chucky sounded like he was speaking in tongues, but then something happened. Chucky had been kneeling with his head bowed for prayer, when suddenly his entire body flew back and onto the floor. His eyes rolled into the back of his head, and at first I misinterpreted this as another Pentecostal experience called being slain in the Spirit, when God lays you out like a light and communes with you. It didn't take long for me to figure out that this was not the work of God. Chucky began writhing on the floor, speaking in weird tongues that I had never heard before, and his eyes looked totally glazed over. I knew he was possessed. And at that time, because of my Pentecostal faith, I believed Chucky was possessed by the devil or a devil, but now I believe it was an evil entity or spirit from the house Mark had been house-sitting for, and that somehow it had followed us back to Jim's house. That's why I couldn't sleep. I had been aware of its presence on some level of consciousness. I was just about to get Jim and Mark when Chucky stopped writhing and sat straight up, stiff as a board, and spoke in a deep voice completely different from his own. It was an unearthly voice, deeper than anything I'd ever heard before. He pointed at me and said in a dark, evil tone, "You." To this day, I don't know what that was all about. In my youth and pious pride, I thought the devil was aware of who I was because I was such a good Christian. I ran upstairs and got Jim, Mark, and their parents. We got our Bibles, and for the next hour and a half, we tried to rebuke the evil spirit that had entered Chucky. He sat up and again bellowed, "You!" once to me, and once to Jim. The more we rebuked, prayed, and quoted Bible verses, the harder Chucky writhed, and the deep, dark, evil voice within him shouted many foul things at us. All these years later, I can't believe that there was any way this young kid with a high-pitched voice could have faked that deep voice. We were grasping at straws, but we were unwilling to give up on Chucky. The next time he started writhing and spewing his dark tongue, we all rebuked the devil in the name of Jesus and placed our King James Bibles on his chest at the same time. Chucky shook violently, and this brought him back. Whatever possessed him had fled, and his normal voice returned. Even now, I get chills thinking about that night. Chucky described what it was like when this evil spirit had possessed him, and he said that gruesome creatures were holding him in a place where everything was white. He had no idea what was going on outside of his body. And as I said, back then I believed in the devils. I don't now, but I do believe there was something evil in that house. I've always been reluctant to tell this story, because I found that most people just don't want to know the truth about what's out there. Haunted Object, submitted by Hazeltine. Most of my life, I was an extremely skeptical person. I'm not talking the skepticism people on those ghost shows claim that they have, when you know full well they've bought into the paranormal hook, line, and sinker. I was raised in the Catholic Church, but never believed a word of it, and even though I went through the motions because my parents wanted me to, even then I was strictly an atheist. I had lots of friends who had what they claimed to be paranormal experiences in their house or wherever, and I did not discount their experiences. I wasn't there, but I was also the first to tell them not to jump to conclusions and to think things out rationally and look for a rational explanation before going to the paranormal as an answer. So, the story I'm about to share with you needs that context for everyone to understand my state of mind and what happened to me. I want to stress that, again, I'm not saying it was ghosts or something from the beyond, but the truth is, what happened to us we could not explain through conventional methods. Having said that, I'm also fully aware that conducting a full scientific investigation using the scientific method is practically impossible in a house. It's not a laboratory, it's not a vacuum, things don't work perfectly. But we did honestly talk a lot about it and did try to find a rational explanation. We moved into our home, which was a new build in 2012. There had only been one previous owner, a young couple who had moved out of state, so when we got the house in 2014, it was really barely lived in. It was a great neighborhood, lots of kids for our kids to play with. My husband John and I have 2 boys and a girl, all under the age of 15, and we all loved living there. Well, I don't know why I said that in the past tense, because we still do live here. 6 months into living in the house, John's mother tragically passed away from stage 4 cancer. It was a rough go, and we were very involved in helping her to be comfortable in her last days. One of the things she wanted John to have when she was gone was a music box that she had used to play to calm him down when he was a child, and that she had had as a child herself. John was an only child, and as silly as it may sound for a man to have a music box, it was an unbelievably sweet gesture on her part, and something that we still cherish and love. However, when we brought the box into our home, that's when strange things started to happen, and they only happened in the rooms or areas where we kept the music box. When we first got it, we put it in our family room on a table. It was a tough reminder for all of us, but it was also comforting to have a piece of my mother-in-law with us at all times. One day, I was not at work, home caring for my youngest who was not feeling well. when I went into the family room and heard music. I will never forget, it was Hey Bulldog by the Beatles. I didn't have a radio on. Our television is hooked up for music channels, but that was not on. And I thought perhaps our neighbors had been playing something outside. So I was standing there in my living room listening clearly to this song and not knowing where it was coming from. I immediately went outside to see if there was a neighbor out there, but no one was. When I went back into the living room, Hey Bulldog could still be heard, loud and clear. The music box lid had been open, and for whatever reason I walked over to it, closed the lid, and immediately the music stopped. I was beyond myself. I opened the lid again, but nothing happened. So I left it open and went about my day taking care of the house and my child. When John got home, I mentioned it to him, and he didn't know what to say. We both knew that my mother-in-law was a huge Beatles fan, but that didn't give us any answers as to why a music box would be connected to a song floating in the air. We chalked it up to something in the airwaves, or perhaps my cell phone was picking up some kind of signal, and we just left it at that. It wasn't until the next morning that we started to get a little more concerned about things. When I got up early to get breakfast ready for everyone and get ready for work myself, I went into the kitchen and looked into our family room. All of our furniture, and I'm talking 2 chairs, a couch, a love seat, plus all of our entertainment center stuff, had been pushed into the middle of the room. For whatever reason, I thought it looked like someone was getting ready to paint. They were trying to cover up all the furniture by just pushing it into the center of the room so everything would be away from the walls. I immediately ran back upstairs and got John, who was just about to get in the shower. I told him he needed to come downstairs right now, so he did. He took one look at the family room and asked how the heck I had been able to do that in the night, and why did I do it? I looked at him without dropping a note and said, "You honestly think I did this?" He said, "Well, who else could have? I certainly didn't." We were not fighting, but our conversation obviously was confused on both sides, and now 2 of our oldest had come downstairs for their breakfast and immediately asked why all the furniture was in the middle of the room. John just laughed and said he was working on something last night and thought maybe we could paint the living room, but he wasn't so sure now. It was a stupid explanation for our kids, just so that they wouldn't think something strange was happening or something was wrong. John gave me a quick hug and said he would take care of it when he got home from work and not to worry about it. We all went about our day, and he did take care of it when he got home. I thought about the music box and wondered if there was a connection to the strange music and this stuff happening in our family room, but again, I just brushed it off and said there's got to be an explanation for this. I thought maybe there was vibrations or something like that, or maybe John had done something in the middle of the night and didn't remember it. He had been a sleepwalker as a kid, and I thought, hey, maybe it came back and he didn't even realize it. That night was a Friday, and Fridays in our family are family nights. We make it a point to spend time as a family, have pizza, and watch a movie and play games. We were all in the family room getting ready to play Uno when the stack of cards that had been sitting on our coffee table that we were getting ready to sit next to spilled out of the box onto the carpet and went all over the floor. I looked at John and didn't say anything. The kid saw it and started asking questions about how we had done that trick. I just told him that it was a funny trick and we wanted to continue on with the evening, not to worry about it. We did, and nothing else happened. That night, without asking John, I took the music box out of the family room and put it into our office/sewing room. When he saw that I'd done that, he asked why I was doing it, and I told him I just wanted to see something. He asked me again what I was doing, and I told him that I wanted to see if anything would happen in our office if the music box was in there. He gave me a look and he said, "Look, there has to be a rational explanation for this. There always is, and I'm surprised you of all people would think that this music box has something to do with anything else in this house." But I said, "Look, I'm doing it anyway," and he didn't say anything else about it. Nothing happened for 2 days, but on Monday morning, as we were all getting ready for our day, I went into the office to get something I needed to take to the bank. The room was a mess of my yarn, and there were papers strewn all over the place. I called John and pointed at it and said, "You know I was not in there all weekend, and I know that you were not in there all weekend, and none of it was like this when we were in here on Friday night. I don't have an explanation for this, do you?" He shook his head and said, "Yeah, this is a little odd." For a moment we entertained the idea that it was one of our kids, or perhaps all of our kids, but they had been with us almost every moment for the last 2 days, and certainly we would have noticed if they had gone in there and started throwing things around. I mean, the noise alone would have tipped us off. Later that day, I cleaned things up in there and took the music box out. Again, without telling John, I put it in a cardboard box and took it down into our basement to store it on a shelf. The next morning, when I went downstairs to get ready for the day, the music box was sitting back in the family room where we had originally placed it. I immediately asked John about it, and he vehemently denied ever touching the box. He wasn't even aware I had put it in the basement. Again, I was beyond myself, and I didn't know what to do. That evening, John took the kids out for ice cream, and I went over to the music box and said aloud, "Look, you're welcome to stay here. If this is Mom, we know that you love us and we love you very much. But we don't want you scaring the kids, and we don't want you messing up the house." I felt really stupid being a skeptical person talking to an inanimate object, but for some reason I felt it had to be done. The music box lid closed on its own, and since then, nothing has happened in our house that we can't explain. I know a lot of people will hear this and think it's bullshit, but it's true, and as much as I don't want to admit that perhaps an object could be haunted or have some kind of pull to the beyond, or something that we can't explain, I can only point to that thing as being the catalyst for the very weird happenings that happened in my home. Weekend Encounter with a Poltergeist by Stacy F. I had heard about the movie Poltergeist, but I didn't expect to spend an evening with such a rambunctious entity. The event in question took place at a friend's family home in Vista, New York. There were 6 young professional adults present for a weekend gathering, and all of us had driven up from New York City earlier that evening. There were 6 young professional adults present for a weekend gathering, and all of us had driven up from New York City earlier that morning. It was a typical blustery fall day, and the iridescent leaves that were falling when the wind tore them from their summer homes showered the ground with flashes of yellows, reds, and oranges, making perfect highlights to the all-gray backdrop. The converted barn that we were making home for the weekend was situated on a lake and was completely surrounded by forest. There were plenty of activities to keep us all busy. Firewood to be collected, beds to be made, food shopping, and other errands to run. After all the details had been attended to, we split up. Some of us went hiking in the woods, one read a book, and others went for a joyride in the convertible that was at our disposal. I opted for the hike in the woods with Maura, our hostess, the only other female present that weekend. By the end of the day, the weather had grown threatening, and the wind became aggressive and unpredictable. It was clear to all that it was time to go inside. We had left the windows and doors open to the fresh air all afternoon, and after closing the building up tight, we built a fire and removed the first course of the evening meal from the fridge to be heated on the stovetop. We were having homemade summer squash and red bell pepper soup. I had been given the responsibility of choosing the music, and when Maura walked by me and asked that I keep an eye on the soup for a minute, I responded with a sure. Maura had just shut the bathroom door when I heard a very strange sound coming from the kitchen. Before I could pick myself up out of the cross-legged position into which I had folded myself, Maura, who had also heard the noise, came rushing out of the bathroom. Basically, we arrived at the scene together. Somehow, the soup had violently exploded, spewing a third of its contents into an area 3 feet in diameter in every direction. Feeling somewhat responsible as I had remained in the living room rather than stationing myself in the kitchen as Maura had been, I picked up the pan, thinking that a swift temperature change must have caused rapid-fire air bubbles to erupt. but when I felt the bottom of the saucepan, it wasn't even warm. "That's really odd," I said to Mora. And we called the rest of the crew into the kitchen and inquired if anyone had tampered with the soup. Everyone claimed to be as confused as we were. We began the task of cleaning up the mess, and Mora became concerned that there might not be enough soup to go around. The cleanup efforts took 20 minutes because we kept finding other places where the soup had splashed, and the fan grate and light just above the stove was the hardest hit. We used a lot of paper towels trying to wipe the infiltrated areas clean. Mora and I were still in the kitchen when Gordon, one of the house guests, decided he wanted a glass of wine. He had just opened the chosen bottle and was in the process of pouring from it when the wine glass he held in his hand flew in a perfect upward arch and then came straight down to the floor. I saw that the glass was taking very deliberate movements, and Gordon seemed to lack any control over the glass. It was as if an invisible hand had knocked it out of his grasp on purpose. We stood there, mouths slightly open, until Gordon asked, more as a joke than a serious question, "Is there a ghost in this house?" "No, there are no ghosts," Mora said emphatically. We all marveled at the fact that the wine glass had broken by the stem and not the delicate rim as would have been expected. "Strange," was Gordon's response. Mora was in the middle of handing out what was left of the homemade soup when, without warning, all of the lights in the house went out. We all became motionless as if our bodies had become pillars of salt, and after a few moments of silence, everyone started speaking at once. I heard someone blame Mora's husband Ed for this most recent situation. I quietly called out for Mora, and when she answered, I took a step closer to the sound of her voice. Then, suddenly the lights came back on. Ed was visibly agitated, and he picked up the phone in order to call the electric company to inquire whether or not the pending storm was causing power outages. His face went ashen. "What's wrong?" Mora asked. "Well, the phone's dead," he said. All at once, everyone began to offer possible causes. The few well-chosen swear words were spoken, and again the entire house lost all power. Ed went to the window to see if the street lights were off as well, because the power to the house was connected to the lines that fed the lights that lined the old country road. Those lights were on, which suggested a blown fuse in the house. The fuse box was in the basement, and no one offered to go down and check it out. It's funny how logic and rational thought disappear when there's an overload in the imagination. "Hey," somebody said, "it's just a storm." By now, Mora had lit candles, and we at least had the glow of the tiny flames to guide our steps. We made our way to the dinner table in almost complete darkness, and sat down just in time for the lights to return all foreign shadows to their proper places. "That's no blown fuse," Ed said. This is going to be an interesting dinner, I thought to myself. A warm fire was behind us, and the conversation around the table soon became centered on the odd occurrences that had taken place in the house. Suddenly, Gordon, who was seated opposite me, stopped with his spoon midway to his mouth. The manner in which his shoulders climbed up to his ears, and his head jerked ever so slightly to the right, made me stop what I was doing and shift my full attention towards the direction from which his reaction had stemmed. I gasped out loud. Within the indoor atrium, which had become sanctuary to a collection of antique weather vanes, a single weather vane, which hung from the ceiling by a chain, was swinging violently in a 180-degree angle. No other object was moving, not even a single fern frond swayed, nothing. The pace which with the lone weather vane was swinging was even-tempered and exact. The violence with which it was swinging was very disturbing. Everyone was watching, unable to fully comprehend the event we were all witnessing. My husband Eric stood up from his chair and took a candle from the center of the table over to the atrium to search for a possible draft of some kind. None was found. All the while, the weather vane continued its mad antics, swinging closer and closer to the wall. There was an orb in the center of the weather vane made of some type of non-opaque glass, and if it were to hit the wall, it would have certainly shattered, which would have left us with all of a lot of explaining to do to Mora's father, who owned the place. I asked Eric, who was still standing, if he could stop the antique vane from swinging. Ed dramatically bellowed out, "Don't touch it!" But Eric reached out and manually stopped the object from swinging. However, just as he did so, our friend Ed immediately started to have trouble breathing. He was hyperventilating and had to go outside into the cold night air to catch his breath. The wine was flowing in our bloodstreams now, and that seemed to help our ability to deal with the events of the evening. The dishwasher had been loaded and the table cleared, and nobody really seemed to want to talk about the incidents. Perhaps there was no way to agree upon an explanation. Soon, however, we couldn't help ourselves, and the discussion turned to what might be going on in the house. Ed was accused by one of the guests of having rigged the whole affair, but I had more than doubted that that was the case. The host decided that, if only to quiet the unrest we were all feeling, he wanted to play a game on the antique roulette wheel that stood in the hallway. En route to the hallway that housed the weathered roulette wheel, Ed stopped dead in his tracks. In the corner of the room that Ed was facing, there was a fine cloud of cold air visible to the naked eye. It was so cold we could see Ed's breath as he exhaled, and nowhere in the house was it that cold. Everyone placed a body part in the cold spot to feel it for themselves, and sure enough, the area was much colder than the thermometer outside, which read at an even 40 degrees. Ed said, "This is really weird." Ed then led everyone over to the roulette wheel. Everyone but me joined in the game of calling out a number to see if the wheel would stop on it. There were some failed attempts at matching the called number to that of the wheel, but when it was Ed's turn, he said something like, "Let's see if that old ghost wants to play with me." He called out a number while challenging the specter to play, and I kid you not, during the next 3 turns, Ed called out the number, and even before the wheel could come to a stop naturally, the wheel stopped abruptly on the exact number he had called. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. I wasn't amused by any of this, and directed my displeasure to the unseen player of the wheel. "Get out of here," I said to this invisible guest. "We're bored with your silly antics. Go find someplace else to camp out." By now it was really late. Maura was the first to announce that she was off to bed and asked Ed to lock up the house. Ed chose me to go around the house and help him secure all the locks on the windows and doors, and together we systematically locked up the entire house. The front door was the last on our rounds, and this was an original door belonging to the barn from which the house had been converted. It was oversized, old, and very heavy. It had a large, black, rusty bolt on it that acted as the knob, and it made a lot of noise when it was slid aside. I watched Ed as he used the weight of his body to aid him in shutting tight the wooden door, and once finished, he gave me a peck on the cheek and took himself up to bed. We 4 guests moved into the den area and sat about discussing the fashions and music of the jazz age of the 1920s and 30s. We had decided to ignore the night's events and spent a pleasant half an hour talking about purely material things. Then I suddenly felt a cold blast of air. The chill was directly followed by a noise that amounted to an almost inaudible creaking sound. I looked at the 3 men who sat opposite me and shook my head. "No way," I said adamantly. I got up from the chair and in one step climbed up the 3 short stairs to peek around the corner to see if what I expected was true. The front door stood wide open, just hanging on its hinges, lying flat up against the wall. I couldn't believe it. The door hadn't made the hideously loud noise it generally made as the door scraped across the threshold, and that was what gave me the creeps. I asked Eric to please close and secure the door once again, and this prompted everyone to call it a night. The other guests disappeared into their allotted rooms, and Eric and I were to sleep in the den. For the first time that evening, I wondered if I could muster up enough energy to drive back to the city. Then I took stock of the hour and the amount that I had had to drink. "All right," I said to this uninvited guest, "if you're spending the night, please go to bed." The lights in the den were on a rheostat. directly following my tired yet motherly command to go to bed, the lights turned themselves up to full brightness, and Eric and I were standing in the middle of the room, staring at each other, when the lights came down to an almost off position, then immediately climbed up again to the highest level of brightness. Finally, they turned and stayed off. That capped off the spooky events for that weekend. But the following weekend, just after midnight, I picked up the telephone receiver to be greeted by a very excited voice repeating, It's happening again! I thought it was a prank caller and almost hung up, but I realized it was Ed, and I sat upright in bed and became alert. What's happening again? I asked him to clarify. Ed then proceeded to tell me that he and Maura had driven up to the house in Vista from Kennedy Airport after picking up some friends of theirs who had just arrived from Europe. They had told their friends the story from the weekend before and were met with disbelief and no small amount of chiding. Upon entering the country house, the two couples had made their way to the atrium so that Ed could show the faithless just what he had been talking about. Ed turned on the light for all to see, and much to the surprise of everyone, the weather vane was again swinging violently. Without interfering with the lightning rod gone mad, Ed immediately phoned me. Why? Good question. I was 5 hours away in Pennsylvania. It was past midnight, and there was nothing I could do over the phone anyway. I told him to calm down and to tell the poltergeist to get the hell out of the house, now. There were no more phone calls and no further incidents. Ed's friends did walk away from the weekend with a bit more of an open mind, but Maura's father still doesn't believe our story. He Called Her Name by Kristen F. I sat up in bed and fumbled for the light, glancing wildly about the dark room. I knew with every fiber of my being that I had not been mistaken about the source of the voice. I would forever recognize the sound of my beloved David's voice, even though he had been taken from me by a heart attack 5 years before. I finally managed to locate the light switch, and I got out of bed, slid my feet into warm slippers, and pulled on my robe. It was a chilly night in late November, and I knew the floorboards would be cold. Kristen, the voice spoke, seemingly just over my shoulder. Look sharp, girl, I heard David say. Something's burning. Look sharp, now. I spun around, hoping to catch at least a fleeting glimpse of my husband's spirit, but I saw nothing. But the voice was so distinctively David's. Years ago, after we had been amused by a British movie in which a military man had always prefaced his commands with a snappy, "Look sharp," we had used the phrase teasingly whenever we wanted the other to get right at a domestic chore. Our cabin's furnace was electric, and I had adjusted the thermostat before retiring. I knew that I had not left on any electrical appliances such as the toaster or an iron, and David had almost been phobic about the idea of our house burning down. His maternal aunt's house had caught fire when he was just a boy, and that lovely old house had burned to the ground. Even worse, David's favorite cousin Kathy had been horribly burned and left badly scarred. Once, 3 or 4 years after we were married in 1943, David had awakened in the night and found some trash smoldering in the kitchen wastebasket. He was mortified when he discovered that he had carelessly dumped an ashtray with a live butt into the trash, and he was horrified when he considered that he could have been responsible for setting our house on fire. He had become even more fearful of fire, and he quit smoking cold turkey that night. As I made my way into the living room to investigate further, I pondered these things and began to consider quite strongly that my mind might have played a kind of mental tape-back of David's voice. I heard a noise in the backyard and looked out a window to see a graceful family of deer moving towards the lake. An owl hooted mournfully from somewhere deep in the forest, and all was peaceful, as it should be. I had just about convinced myself that I had only awakened from a strangely vivid dream when, as if in answer to my mental debate and its rational conclusion, I heard David's voice once again. This time the message was brief and forceful. The cabin is on fire. Becoming even more confused and perhaps a little frightened, I walked from room to room in the ranch-style cabin. Nothing. I could find no source of any threatening flames. Earlier that evening, when I had taken my nightcap of warm cocoa, I had built a nice crackling wood fire in the fireplace. The fire had burned out hours earlier, and there were only a few glowing embers still visible beyond the fire screen. Fire! David's voice was insistent and demanding. I began to cry in frustration. Where? I asked. Please tell me where. I leaned back against the wall next to the brick chimney in a state of seeming near collapse, and then suddenly I felt that the wall was hot. When I turned to place my open palm against the wall, I was horrified to find that it was extremely hot to the touch. Through a tiny crack between the fireplace mantel and the wall, I could see raging flames. The house was on fire. I forced myself to remain as calm as possible and headed for the telephone in the kitchen to dial 911. Although the village was small, it had an excellent volunteer fire department, and I knew that they would get to me as quickly as possible. After I cradled the receiver, it seemed as though I had, at last, become truly wide awake. I could quite clearly hear the terrible crackling sound of the fire spreading towards the roof. Tendrils of dark smoke were moving across the living room like the greedy fingers of fire seeking objects for consumption. I decided it would be safer to await the fire department in the yard, and even as I was pulling on a heavy coat to wear over my robe, I heard the eerie wail of a siren shrilling to a summons of the volunteer firemen. "Thank you, David," I said to the stars. "Thank you, my darling, for saving my life." The prompt action of the local firefighters prevented the complete destruction of our cabin, but the estimated cost of the repairs played a major factor in my decision to move into an apartment in a nearby city. I miss the solitude of our cabin by the lake, but I strongly sense that David's spirit feels better now that I am closer to our friends and family, and I am no longer so lonely. He called her name. Here's a story from my files. My bachelor party was not a traditional bachelor party. We didn't do the stripper thing. I didn't have it at a beer hall. We didn't have a whole bunch of guys giving me a bunch of money. My brother just threw it in my own backyard, which, honestly, was really cool. We played poker, smoked cigars, had way too many Molson exports, and also wheeled out a TV into the yard so we could have a Nintendo Super Tecmo tournament. It was a blast. We had a ton of fun, had a fire afterwards, and were just chilling out and enjoying ourselves. My bride-to-be had been dispatched to do something else, and when she got home, she hung out with me around the fire while everybody else took off, and it was just me, her, and our wonderful dog, Lance. But something odd happened. The back corner of our yard, it was a pretty deep lot, but we had neighbors on either side and into the rear. It was a obviously very suburban place. The back corner of our lot got unbelievably dark. Like, you couldn't even see into it. And Lance, the paranormal pup, was not happy about it and stood a little bit away from it and just was growling and then started barking at this blackness, which was, again, I said odd. I ran into the house, grabbed a flashlight, and shone it into the darkness, and it didn't do anything. So I know this sounds crazy, this sounds really weird, but this is the truth. So I grab Lance, and I'm like, all right, this is messed up. I don't know what's going on here. And then I'm also thinking, geez, you know what? You're a few pops deep. Let's just call it a night. No big deal. Can't explain this, whatever. As I'm walking back to the house, I see a man in my house, an older man, walk past my kitchen window. And I'm like, what the hell was that? So I get Lance back to my beautiful bride. I go inside the house, check around, nobody's there. Front door's locked. There's no way that anybody could get in the house. I don't tell my bride because I certainly don't want to freak her out. But we go inside and we're chilling out. And I decide that I'm going to go upstairs and get cleaned up because I've been by a fire, kind of gross. And I'm in the bathroom, maybe 5 minutes, and I hear my wife scream, run up the stairs, and start pounding on the bathroom door, and I've got to come out. She needs me, and something's wrong. So I get out. I said, what the hell's going on? And she says that the dog is staring at the back kitchen window, and she saw a dark shape on the outside of the house go past it, and she's really upset. So I run down there and I check things out, and Lance is standing in our living room that goes right into the kitchen, growling, and he's got the little ridge of hair up his back. He's a golden retriever, okay? So remember that he's a golden retriever. They're the nicest, sweetest, most lovable dogs in the world, and when they get pissed, something's usually really off. So I check around the house. There's nothing there. Can't explain it. And that was that. Nothing else happened that night. Everything was cool. Everything was calm. And we obviously wrapped up the evening and walked away from it going, boy, that was strange. I cannot explain that guy walking past my window. I cannot explain that dark spot in the back corner of our yard. It never happened again. But for whatever reason, something strange happened at our place right there in the gorgeous village of Williamsville, New York. Thanks for listening to this episode, guys. I hope you like the ghost stories. Got much more coming up for you. If you have a true scary story that you would like to hear on this channel, be sure to email me, unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.net. I read them all. Thanks to everybody who is submitting stories. There's a little bit of a backlog, trying to go back and forth with the volumes and the category-based episodes. So if you've sent me something and you haven't heard it yet, have patience, it's coming. Please check out my website, truescarystories.net, and if you haven't already, hey, think about becoming a patron and supporting the channel. I'm keeping it ad-free just for you guys. Please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment if you care to. I respond to everything. And be excellent to each other. I'll see you in the next episode. But until then, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.